All right. I figured it might be worth me talking a little bit about vintage racing. Um, this channel is mostly about my vintage RC cars and the projects I do in the racing, but it's not just that. When I have a chance to do modern stuff as well, I do that. Um, but the majority of the balance of my videos is about vintage stuff. But I never really I don't think I've had like any sort of proclamations or philosophical discussion about vintage racing the way that I see it. So let's say the short story is I think that there is a difference between vintage racing and modern racing. Um, and I think it's also important to keep that in mind as the vintage market is growing. We've seen over the last couple of years an increase in the number of vintage races being held throughout the country. I think overall that's a good thing for a number of reasons, uh, but also we you can't necessarily apply the same formula to a vintage race as you can for a modern race. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you go to a modern race, what's that going to be like? If whether it's on turf or carpet or dirt, generally speaking, modern races are highly competitive, right? They're especially the large modern races, they're very serious, right? You're spending if you're at a dirt track that's prepared surface, you're spending a lot of time on tire prep. You're saucing your tires and getting high on fumes, I guess, and really putting a lot of time and energy into making sure that when you do get out there on the track, your car is as grippy as it can be, and you're hitting your marks, and you're spending a lot of your energy being serious about getting the most out of the event because you've invested so much just to be there. Um, and what generally ends up happening is that as the grip level increases, going from a loamy track to a dirt track to a hard packed dirt track to a dirt track with glue on it to turf or carpet, as the grip level goes up, your reaction times drop, which means your mental energy uh, is much more focused on the car, which means the amount of energy you're focusing on having fun and enjoying yourself drops. So grip goes up generally, not all the time, but generally as the grip level increases, the fun factor goes down. And that is what makes modern racing increasingly challenging and perhaps even increasingly inaccessible to newcomers who are really just trying to have a good time. Um, Vintage racing, I believe, fills that void, that gap, because these cars were built for tracks that are not ultra high grip, right? These cars were designed and built in the 80s and 90s when tracks were looser dirt, lower grip, and you had to fight for mechanical grip. Yeah, you had to find the right tire and the right suspension setup and slipper clutch settings and all the rest of it to get traction, sort of the old fashioned way. And that's kind of antithetical to how we do things today with modern racing, where instead of focusing on suspension setup, you download a setup that XYZ world class racer has. You just copy paste that onto your car. You bring some slick tires, you sauce them up, and you just go out on the track and rip it. Very different kind of racing. Now, what happens is if you're going to expand the vintage market, inevitably you're going to end up including people who are more used to modern racing, uh, because you're trying to grow the market into a new audience. Well, if that involves modern racers bringing their modern racing mentality to vintage racing, eventually that's going to take the fun out of vintage racing because the mentality around vintage racing is different. And you can apply this to, or you can take a lesson from full scale racing. So if you compare, let's say, Formula One, which is the one of the most serious motorsport classes, to like the Goodwood Festival of Speed, where you have professional race car drivers, but they're driving like Ferrari 250 GTOs and Lotus Elans and all these like beautiful old vintage cars around a racetrack, and they're racing them, but they're not trying to like kill each other for a win. they're getting enjoyment out of taking these beautiful cars out on the track and making them go fast, but for the sake of um, the enjoyment of it. It's like a celebration of those cars and the heritage that they bring to motorsport. I would argue that vintage RC racing is substantially the same thing, right? There are cars that are historically significant that everybody knows about, like the Losi Double X, for example. That's a very well-known vintage car. And seeing that go around a racetrack is a really cool thing for most people. So if you're going to have a vintage race, you want to try to tap into that enthusiasm without getting too serious about the actual competitiveness aspect of the race. Now that's a tough balance to achieve sometimes, because it is, after all, a race. You are racing to win. So yes, it is going to be intrinsically a competitive endeavor, but you have to be careful to do it in such a way that people still have fun. And when you have racers in the pits saucing their tires and getting way too serious about their racing, and the drivers are yelling at each other, and you got, drivers yelling at marshals and race directors yelling at the drivers because they're just, the intensity level is so high, because the grip level is so high, and everyone's trying to go as fast as possible. That takes the fun out of it. So to anyone out there who wants to organize a vintage race, I would implore you to try to do it at a track where the grip level is actually on the lower side. Why? Well, that means the cars get to slide around more, so the driving style is more vintage-like. You have to fight for mechanical grip rather than sauce the tires. So it has to be a track that's kind of lower grip, but also where adding traction compound or saucing the tires or tire prep doesn't really buy you anything. That would be the ideal track. If you don't have access to that, I understand, but all that really means is you're not really doing vintage racing. If you're racing on a prepared, like glued surface or whatever, okay, it's what you got, but don't try to pretend that that's real vintage racing. It's not. It's not even close. And what's going to come with that is the price of having, essentially racing that's a little too intense, especially for the types of cars that you're driving. So that's something that worries me a little bit about the proliferation of vintage races over the last few years, that the culture around vintage racing that has existed up to this point, gosh, I sound like a grumpy old man, but that's probably going to end up changing. And maybe not for the better, because if you have this expansion of the market and more of these vintage races for the sake of a business proposition, it's not even about the passion for racing. It's, oh, there's this market out there, I want to capitalize on that, so let me have a vintage race so I can make money, and maybe turn it into a point series so I can make even more money. Then you're turning it into a business. When you turn it into a business, it stops being fun. But when you start doing that, you're going to kind of alienate the people who do it because it's fun. So that worries me a bit. You're no longer really celebrating the heritage of the cars. It's all about, all right, let's go to this track and try to go super fast, rather than let's go to this track and bring out a bunch of vintage cars and have a fun time doing it. So I don't know if I'm really articulating this very well, but I'm kind of worried about that. And there have been a couple of vintage races lately that have been on or are going to be on relatively high grip surfaces, and I'm curious to see how that actually plays out, because most of the vintage races I've done have been on lower grip surfaces, and they've been a huge amount of fun because you're exercising the cars more or less as they were originally designed, rather than trying to adopt a vintage car for a modern track. So, for example, If you go to a smooth, hard packed dirt track that's basically concrete with glue on it, there's no point in running something like a low CG RX2 with a trailing arm rear suspension, because those suspensions were designed for bumpy tracks. So, yeah, you can put that car on the track, but it's going to do horribly because it's not designed for that track. And if that's the case, you're not really having fun. So then you're going to end up having this homogeneity of the types of cars that you use for that track. If it's that high of a grip, you're going to want a car with a lower center of gravity. It's something that's relatively lightweight because you already have all this natural grip on the track. And that's going to reduce the optimal choices that you have, right? There are only a certain number of vintage two-wheel drive buggies, for instance, that meet that criteria. And so you're going to see people sort of converge toward those, which means in your two-wheel drive buggy class, 9 out of 10 cars are going to be exactly the same. What's the fun in that? That's not fun. The diversity of the design and material choices that showed up in these cars during this era is what makes it so interesting. To see an A-main where you have, 7 different cars out of a 10-car field, that's really cool, because then you get to see all these different designs really up against each other in an environment that is sort of more suitable for how the cars were designed. Again, a relatively low grip track. High grip track, you're not going to see that. You're going to see a bunch of low C double X's racing 1 or 2 RC10s, and that's it. To me, that's kind of boring. Likewise for four-wheel buggy, right? I don't want to see an A-main where 9 out of 10 cars are low C double X4s. Yes, they're good cars, but there are other good four-wheel buggies out there as well. And I would prefer to be at a track where the track design and the track surface is such that having a double X4 doesn't offer you an intrinsic advantage. That would be more fun. So, yeah, I guess that's one thing I'd like to point out. I guess the other thing is, to be fair to everybody, different people have different definitions of how they have fun, what defines fun for them when they go racing, whether it's modern racing or vintage racing. How I define fun for me also varies a little bit between modern and vintage racing. So if I'm going to a modern race, for me, having fun is being competitive. Not necessarily winning the race, but knowing that I'm in the fast group and comfortably racing among the fast group. I can leave the track at the end of the day knowing that I did well, even if I didn't win the race. That matters a little less to me. In a vintage race, having fun to me is not only that, knowing that I was competitive, or rather knowing that I got the most out of the car that I could for that day, but also, it kind of sounds kind of cheesy, but seeing cool cars go around the track, right? Like a Traxxas TRX3, to me, is a way cooler car than a modern lay-down gearbox two-wheel drive buggy. So seeing this go around the track and piloting it myself personally, that's fun. Especially in a diverse field where it could be that and a Super Astute and a Double X and an RC10, where there's a lot of diversity of design and materials from cars of that era. That's kind of neat. So that's, for me, a big reason why I really enjoy going to the Vintage Off-Road Nationals as my sort of vintage race of choice. By and large, the tracks that we've been to at that race have been on the, I don't want to say low grip side, but let's say lower grip side. We tend to avoid having tracks where you don't have to fight for mechanical grip, or where tire preparation, offers you a clear advantage. There have been a couple of outliers, but by and large, the tracks we've been to, the tire prep doesn't really do much for you. It's all on you to get the suspension set up right and to pick the right tread and tire compound, but saucing doesn't really help you necessarily in most cases. So that's good. And of course, the actual environment itself. It's a fun environment. It's full of people who are genuinely invested in the vintage endeavor, right? It's a lot of guys who spent years collecting vintage cars and trying to come up with interesting new builds, and trying to see how they do on the track. It's like this highly sort of experimental thing where, okay, I did this cool thing with my Kyosho or with my Losi or whatever, and I want to try that out, rather than, you know, let's say, I'm not even going to accuse other races of doing this, but let's just say hypothetically, some cookie cutter race where people who don't really understand vintage cars, uh, in a great level of depth, just say, oh, I bought an RC10, I'll build it, put a pretty paint scheme on it, thank my sponsors, you know, go and race and call it a day and say, hey, I'm a vintage racer. Well, are you really? How much do you really understand about vintage cars and really tuning them? If it's just a one-time deal and then you post about it on Facebook and you act like you're a vintage racer, oh gosh, I guess I sound like a grumpy old man in saying this, that you're not a real vintage racer unless you've been doing it for, 10 years. I don't want to say that. But what I mean to say is, having a sort of passion about vintage cars generically, and having an intellectual investment in understanding them and trying to really experiment with them, that's a different level than just buying a re-release car, building it, throwing it on the track, doing a race, and saying you're a vintage racer, right? Those are two different things. And I personally tend to prefer to race with people who like to geek out, maybe that's the right term, people who like to geek out on different vintage cars. Oh, you got this car, I never saw this before, that's really cool, right? Oh, you made this little tweak over here on this thing, that's really cool, I never thought of that. Those are the kinds of experiences that I want to have at a vintage race. And having those sort of discussions with people in the pits, and really taking a look at their car and seeing what neat little tricks they played to make their car a little quicker or a little stronger or more durable or whatever, like, that's the cool stuff. I'd say that's like half of the cool stuff. And then putting it to test on the track. So that's another thing that's good about the Vintage Off-Road Nationals is, okay, you have that sort of camaraderie type of pit experience, while at the same time you have some pretty competitive drivers there. So the racing is also really good in the competitive classes, like 4.0 buggy, 2.0 buggy, that kind of stuff. So it's a really good balance between the two. And there's also enough sort of fun classes, like the wheelie class, to kind of break the tension a bit, to keep everything sort of lighthearted. The Team Associated race, for example, that they're going to do in Las Vegas, I have a lot that I could say about it, but I did notice that, at least based on the poster that I saw, it only appears to have like two-wheel drive buggy and four-wheel drive buggy split up through like different bands of years. Okay, that's fine, but like, where's the fun stuff? Is there no monster truck class? There's no plastic tub chassis class. There's no wheelie class. There's no like some class to sort of break up the tension and sort of remind people of what got them into these cars in the first place, and sort of featuring those cars like Tamiya Strikers and Hornets and Frogs. And yes, they all drive like crap, but just to have a class like that where people can just be a little bit silly and just have a bit of fun. If you don't have that, breaking up the tension through the day or through the race weekend, then it's all serious classes and it's just go, set up the car, tire prep, because the modern tracks are all about tire prep now. Then how are you enjoying yourself? It's just another race, right? If it's just another race, why would I invest all this money into vintage cars if I could just run my modern cars that run better on those kinds of tracks and where parts are more accessible, so I can push the car harder anyway if I'm really trying to be that competitive. So I kind of don't see the point in having a vintage race where you don't have that variety of classes to sort of really like show the full spectrum of what kinds of cars existed once upon a time that got people into this hobby in the first place. So Vonaz does a really good job at that. There are other races that have adopted similar rule sets and similar classes with their own sort of, adaptations, which is fine. But in doing so, I really hope that they also be mindful of the type of track that they race at, because that also matters. And I've generally said this before, but as the grip level goes up, the fun goes down. I believe that pretty adamantly. If you go from loamy dirt to hard packed dirt with glue on it to AstroTurf or carpet, you're going faster and faster with each evolution of the track. And as you go faster, the racing line shrinks, right? The number of optimal paths around the track reduces as the grip level goes up, because you're going so quick that your reaction times have to be that much shorter to optimally navigate the car around the track. You end up with basically, at the theoretical limit, just a single racing line. But on a real dirt track where you can let the car slide around a bit, there's different ways of sliding around a corner. There's different ways of sliding around, the landing on a jump to approach a corner. And so that variety gives you not only more margin for error, but also more variety in the type of racing you can have. Whereas if you're on a super high grip track, that variety shrinks. This is just one racing line, and if you go offline, it's a big risk, and it's just a lot harder to make a pass or anything like that. So the nature of the racing changes completely. So again, that's like one thing that worries me about the expansion of vintage racing, at least in the United States. That yes, okay, you maybe get more variety of tracks, but some of those tracks aren't going to be ideally suited for vintage racing. So don't expect that if you have a vintage race on a manicured track with surface prep such that all the guys going to the track got to bring clay slicks and sauce the tires to hell in order to really even operate the car on the track, that's going to result in people having fun. I don't think so. I'm sorry. You got to pick the right track. So, okay, this is that part. Let's see, maybe we can talk a bit about different rule sets. In my opinion, I think each vintage race should have its own set of rules. I don't think that having the same rules across all the vintage races is necessarily a good idea, because in different regions of the country you could have different types of classes that are popular. For example, 17.5 buggy is pretty popular in the Northeast, but elsewhere in the country, 21.5 buggy is pretty popular. So then if you force people to conform to a specific expectation for what motor you put into your two-wheel drive class, that's not necessarily great. The only reason you would want homogeneity in the rule sets across your vintage races is if you want to do something like a national tour or a point series. But if it gets to that level, I think it's kind of, no pun intended here, missing the point. Why do I think a point series is a bad idea? Well, on the one hand, you could say it helps increase the awareness of vintage racing. It'll increase the market presence of vintage racing. Okay, that's fine. But that's a business argument. It's not a racing argument, right? Is the racing going to be any better? Is the racing experience going to be any better if you turn it into a point series? No, it's not. Chances are you're going to fuck it up, because you're focusing on the event itself and making the event big and marketing it and turning it into this big deal, when what you should really be focusing on is the racing experience. And point series tend to not focus on the racing experience. They're focused on the tour of going from track to track, race to race, and managing a championship. I don't care if you're the vintage racing national champion. For what? I don't know. I just don't see the point in that. And by the way, the people who are like, who really love vintage, who really are into it, they probably don't have the time or resources to travel a country doing a point series anyway. So the ones who would end up being successful in a point series are the guys who probably don't even care about vintage. They're probably doing it because it's going to, very likely, the most practical way of doing a point series like that would be to piggyback an existing race, right? An existing tour. Well, then if you're piggybacking an existing tour, you're probably a modern racer anyway. You don't prioritize vintage racing. It's just another thing that you pick up to say, all right, yeah, well, we'll do some vintage racing here. Oh, I collected some points. Big deal. So I don't see a point series as really going anywhere. Even though, like, at a high level, it kind of sounds like a cool idea, but when you actually try to put it into practice, I don't see it really working for helping true vintage racing grow. Okay, so there's that. Let's see, what else do I want to point out? Maybe the cost of racing. That's also kind of important. Again, guys who have a lot of these vintage cars, they may not be that rich, right? Maybe the Losi XX or the RC10 team car or the Traxxas TRX one that they have is something that just they've had for the last 30 years, and they just want an opportunity to go back on the racetrack and run it again, right? They're not like me, a collector with access to resources to spend big money on cars, which means that they're likely not going to have the resources to spend big money on registration fees for a race. Okay, so if you really want to open up vintage racing to people who were sort of in it from the beginning, let's say, vintage people, because they're old, you have to make it accessible to them too. And you're not going to do that by having these large whiz-bang events where, in order to cover the cost of production for these big events, you have to jack up the registration fee, right? The Team Associated vintage race that they're having in Las Vegas, I heard it's something like $150 per class. Are you out of your fucking mind? I mean, are you out of your fucking mind? That's ridiculous. Now, I can understand if, like, maybe they're building a temporary track, and so they got to truck in dirt and build a track and all that. Okay, that costs money. I get it. But why would you even do that to begin with? There's tracks all around the country you can go to, and if a big company like Team Associated wants to host a vintage race, I'm sure there's plenty of tracks that would trip over themselves to host a race like that, and they'd be more than happy to. And it would reduce the cost for the people trying to organize the race, in this case Associated, and it would therefore reduce the cost that gets carried down or passed down to the customer, the people who are trying to attend the race. Instead of paying $150 for registration, you could pay $30 or $40 per class, which is a more typical registration fee for even, like, a medium to large size trophy race. That's a more fair price to pay. So you're going to price out a lot of people from that race just by being too goddamn expensive. And then what are you going to accomplish with that? Right? Oh, we had a vintage race. It's the biggest race in the country. Why? Because you said so? Big deal. Big deal. Think about all the racers that aren't going there that have a really awesome vintage collection and would otherwise love to be there, but it's just cost prohibitive. You've just priced them out. Congratulations. Not a smart move on their part. Let's see. Yeah, I guess I've already gone on for almost half an hour here. So I hope that kind of covers it. And again, I don't want to sound like a grumpy old man where I'm like saying that there's only one way that vintage culture should be. That's not really what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is people who are really into vintage have a passion for it. And if you want to grow the market, or not even grow the market, that's the wrong term, but if you want to grow the participation in vintage racing, you have to be mindful of the passion that drives it to begin with. Because nobody makes these, I mean, okay, there's re-release cars, but a lot of these cars nobody makes anymore. It takes dedication and commitment and genuine, like, geeked out interest and passion to get these cars and make them race worthy. And that's a decidedly different mentality and approach toward vintage racing than the cookie cutter approach I mentioned earlier, where you just buy a re-release kit, slap it together, and go to a race. that doesn't, those two approaches don't necessarily combine very nicely. So that the key here should be really not so much to increase the number of people who participate in a vintage race. I mean, yes, that is a metric and it matters, but it's more about how do we grow the interest in vintage RC cars, the passion in them. And again, let's take lessons from full scale cars, right? If you wanted to have a vintage full scale car event that features like 1960s Mustangs and Camaros and, 1960s Ferraris and McLarens and Lotuses and all that stuff. In the 70s and 80s and 90s, I guess technically 90s is vintage cars too now. Would you necessarily do that by re-releasing, a McLaren F1? I'm sure there'd be a demand for it, absolutely. But or are you better serving that effort by enhancing the interest in those cars? What makes a Ferrari 250 GTO interesting? What makes a Lotus Elan interesting? What makes an Alfa Romeo Giulia interesting? Why are people passionate about those cars? That's what we need to focus on. And once you do that, then you build genuine interest in vintage cars, genuine geeked out interest. And then that will allow you to grow participation in vintage in general. And then that will allow you to grow vintage racing. In my opinion, that's the way to do it. Rather than host a big ass race, charge a big fat fee, maybe get some big names to sign on to your race so that you can market the race as being this kind of big deal. Oh, we're the premier vintage race. I don't give a shit. Right? If you're not doing it the right way, it's not really going to amount to a permanent, lasting, impact on expanding the vintage community. So I think I've kind of said enough at this point, and I'm probably going to piss some people off. And if I did, I just want you to know that I don't give a shit. These are my opinions and not yours. So anyway, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.